Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our series on the intelligent intranet. My name is Mike Holste, and I'm a product marketing manager in the modern workplace at Microsoft. Last time, we discussed solutions that help drive and assist with employee engagement. And in today's discussion, we'll bring back Matt, our senior program manager, who will share some tips and best practices on how to gain that all-important key stakeholder investment inside of your company. We'll bring back our friends at Standard Bank, who will talk about their experience in doing this in the real world and driving alignment to their goals. Do you remember the 4 stages of intranet building? Explore, align, implement, and engage. Today, we're going to focus on stage 2. And we want you to walk away with an understanding of how to get alignment with key stakeholders on vision, how to identify key scenarios and prioritize them, and then build your roadmap. So let's get started. So I'd like to welcome back Matt, our senior program manager.
So I'm Matt, and I'm a program manager within the OneDrive and SharePoint customer engineering organization at Microsoft. And I focus on helping our customers be successful with their intranets and other SharePoint and Office 365 related scenarios. And speaking to customers that have gone through this intranet journey, some of them reflect back to me that it can feel like they're climbing a mountain. The good news in all of this, though, is that you can ask for help. You don't have to do this alone. In fact, to be successful, you must ask for help from your stakeholders. We're going to cover today some of the approaches that you can use to get that stakeholder buy-in and align with them on a common vision for your intranet. To get their buy-in, we must know what they care about the most. And you can see the 2 most common intranet stakeholder groups represented here on the slide: HR, corporate communications, and what are some of the common needs that get expressed. While these are the most common stakeholders, they shouldn't be the only ones that you engage as part of your intranet project. You'll want to bring in, for example, a line of business to represent what the line of business needs are for intranets and for maybe a portal that they'll need to have be part of the intranet, and similarly for different business functions. And later on, we're going to hear from our friends at Standard Bank, who are going to share with us the different stakeholder groups that they worked with on their intranet project and how they got them engaged. So stay tuned for that. So what I'm sharing with you here is the level of depth that we see our most successful intranet customers getting to in order to deeply understand those priorities and challenges that their stakeholders have. These are real examples from customers. One customer that we've spoken with had a real challenge with a diverse workforce across different locations, as well as different types of working styles. So for example, they had a bunch of employees who worked in the corporate head office. Then they had a bunch of employees, a pretty large population of those who worked remotely. And then finally, another large population of field workers. And so their priority was bringing this group together as one company and to build a cohesive culture. So that's the level of understanding that you'll want to get to. There's lots of different ways that you can get this insight. I'm sure many of you actually have this perspective today. We're going to hear from Standard Bank, who are going to share with us how they meet with each of the different stakeholder groups to get this insight to help inform the scenarios and planning that ultimately happens for the intranet project. And the way that we do that is we use scenarios to answer that question that inevitably they're asking, the what's in it for me. And so if we can come up with some good scenarios that help address the needs of these different stakeholders, then we're going to get engagement, we're going to get investment. So it's really, really important that we focus our time in building those relevant scenarios across all of the different stakeholder groups that we work with. And our role as the intranet project owner is to take our understanding of their priorities and our knowledge of the different capabilities of SharePoint and Microsoft 365 so that we can sit with them to build scenarios that are going to be relevant for those and act as a good reason for our stakeholders to engage, because they're naturally going to be excited about those possibilities and want to help make that happen as part of this broader intranet project. So I've seen a lot of different approaches to defining scenarios. The one I'm showing now is the one I favor, and it's one that we've assembled a template around that's available on this site so that you can use this within your own organization. But what I wanted to do is walk you through first the anatomy of a well-written scenario, and then go through an example of what that looks like. And so let's start with breaking down the main components scenario. And it starts with defining who the scenario is for. So as someone in blank, you would fill in the blank with the team that the scenario is intended for. Then it's about describing what that team wants to accomplish. Then you move on to defining the different technology components. How is that need going to be accomplished using the different parts of SharePoint and Microsoft 365? And then finally, you need to know how you're going to measure whether or not this scenario has been successful. So this is all about defining your success metrics. So with that framework in mind, let's actually go through a real example. And in this case, we're going to focus in on sales management. What they want to accomplish is train their sales reps on new products that the company is launching. And so they want to be able to reach this geographically dispersed group of salespeople around the country and around the world with the right training at the right time. And so next up is, how will they do this? So you could write the sentence as using all these different components of SharePoint, including SharePoint communication sites, news, and Microsoft Stream, which is our video streaming service that's part of Microsoft 365. These building blocks could be assembled to create a sales training portal that salespeople, when they get alerted that a new product is being launched by the company that they need to go out and sell to customers, they're then brought back to this sales portal where they can consume the training that is available through a stream video. And then finally, how do we know if sales management, who are owning this scenario and this process, how do we know if we've been successful? Well, it could be as simple as asking that seller, once they've completed the required training, to fill out a short survey, click off that they've completed it, and then provide an assessment score on how much that training is helping them be a more effective seller of that product. So now that you have your scenario framework, the next step is to go back to the stakeholders that you've been working with and understanding their business priorities, basically apply that scenario framework to come up with relevant scenarios underneath each of the business priorities that you've identified with them. So let's take HR as an example here, and they've indicated that a big priority for them is to improve employee engagement. And so using that framework and your knowledge of the different capabilities of SharePoint and more broadly Office 365, think through what are some of the scenarios that can help HR improve employee engagement. And you'll start to brainstorm. Don't reject the ideas, just start getting them out there. And then from there, you can screen them to determine which ones that you're going to want to move forward with. This is where you can be really creative and innovative. And it should be done in partnership between yourselves as the IT project owners alongside the business stakeholder. And you can see some examples that we've generated here. A digital workspace or the intranet obviously goes a long way in driving employee engagement. A leadership site that connects leaders to employees can be really impactful in terms of getting that new employee engagement. So there's a long list of scenarios that you could generate, and then you move on to the next set of stakeholders and start filling in, using that framework that we took a look at a moment ago, the right scenarios within each of those priorities. Now, because you can't do everything at the same time, you have to prioritize to be able to stagger this work. And there's, again, like anything with these frameworks, many different ways to prioritize. I like to do it according to the impact and ease of implementation of a particular scenario. And again, this is what we provided a template for you to use within your own organization. Now, the way that this works is your high priority items, what's in the top right quadrant, that's really the sweet spot. Those are the scenarios that you're going to focus on first. And so you'll assess each of your scenarios. And if, for example, they have both high impact and they're easy to implement, then they'll be placed in that top right quadrant, the highest priority scenarios. And let's just run through an example that explains that logic a little bit more. Company news is something that it can be quite transformational relative to how a lot of organizations create and distribute news in their organization today. So huge improvements SharePoint out of the box. And the fact that SharePoint news is out of the box, it makes it quite easy to implement. There isn't any customization that's required there. And from a process standpoint, these communicators who need to post news and announcements, they'll find it a tremendous step up relative to the outdated and antiquated ways in which they're publishing and distributing news today. So that one definitely feels like a quick win and a high priority item. As you continue that exercise, ranking the scenarios across their impact and the ease of implementation, you'll build out the remainder of what's in your medium priority bucket and low priority bucket. And these aren't, your low priority item is still something, provided it meets a minimum bar, it's still worth pursuing. You're just saying with this that it's something that we're going to do later on as part of our roadmap. And let's now take a look at that roadmap and how we'll plot those prioritized scenarios here accordingly. So obviously the highest priority scenarios, the ones that we saw included company news, new hire sites, those were in the top right quadrant. They're going to be the ones that we want to tackle first. We want to get those quick wins. We'll do those in the first 3 months. And then your medium priority items come next, and so on and so forth. So you basically now have plotted all the scenarios that you want to pursue across a roadmap and schedule. And of course, the timeline that you use here for your roadmap is obviously whatever makes the most sense for you. I've just chosen a year for illustrative purposes. All right, so today we talked through some different methods and how you can align with your stakeholders and get them to engage and buy into the process. I'd like to thank you for listening in, and I'm going to throw it back to Mike.
Thanks, Matt. That's super helpful information. And getting key stakeholder investment is such a crucial step for any organization when they're on their intranet building journey. So now we'd like to jump back over to the discussion Matt had with our folks at Standard Bank and see how they worked through these next few steps.
Well, welcome back to our conversation with Ian Doyle and Jenine Klerk from Standard Bank. We're talking about the journey they went on with their Intelligent Intranet project. And today we're going to be diving into how Ian and Jenine worked with stakeholders to align on a common vision and set of scenarios. So really excited to dive into that topic. But before we get there, Ian, if I could ask you to introduce yourself, and then maybe after that, Jenine, if you could do the same.
Matt, it's really good to be back with you. I'm Ian Doyle. I'm from part of the technology organization in Standard Bank, and I largely focus on the employee experience and the digital workplace.
Thanks for having us back, Matt. So I'm Jenine Klerk, and I form part of group marketing and communication, and I look after all group platforms internally and externally for the organization.
So to get us started here, Ian, if you could talk about the different stakeholders that you worked with throughout the project, what their role is, and how you worked with them on the project.
Matt, yeah, we've always seen it as being three distinct groups. So starting with the business stakeholders, those are clearly critical role players, and as a cross-functional team, we did spend a lot of time trying to get aligned, building relationships with them. These are essentially the people that have the accountability for the profit and loss And it's really important to make sure that we're driving an agenda that services their requirements. I suppose business stakeholders can vary in terms of where they're based, and one of the things that many corporates, such as a bank such as ours, are often guilty of is driving things from the center and out across all the various jurisdictions that you operate in. And it's really important that you don't lose sight, if you're a multinational, that there's representation and engagements happening in relationships being built out of the respective countries, or if you're a more geographically housed business unit, that you're able to transcend those boundaries where your organization is based. So they were a very key group. The second group that we've spent a lot of time and have been a very key enabler to this is these enabling entities that often exist in a corporate, such as marketing, where Jenine is from. Our human capital team have been pivotal parts of this process. And if anyone, just some sort of guidance from my side, if anyone's currently on a journey on the intranet and they don't have those two key stakeholder sets lined up and actively engaged on it, I'd strongly encourage that you pause, kind of reset, get them on board, and reboot the program and carry on from there. So it's really important that they play a role. And the third enabling entity that we've also extended as part of this process has been our real estate team, and that's because where one views a digital workplace, you've also got to make sure that the physical workplace is also one that people aspire to come and work and engage with. It can also be quite strategically used around driving people and traffic to the online space. So there's a reciprocal relationship that comes there, but it's between the three of those stakeholder groups and technology. You've got a really powerful team that you can drive out an agenda and enhance the employee brand, the corporate brand as well, that gets associated with that. And finally, and certainly by no means the least, is the employees. And one has got to make sure that you're connected and engaged with them, and listening very attentively to what their needs are. And you can do that through different ways. You can build it through a champions network and make sure that you filter and cascade information that way. Another way could be doing surveys, and we did a lot of those things up front to understand what worked and what didn't work for those employees. But the ultimate part is you've got to have this regular feedback loop, and between all three of those stakeholder sets, keep your eye on them, and make sure that you're adjusting as they evolve in their business priorities every day.
Thanks, Ian. That's a really interesting answer. I don't think a lot of people associate the real estate function as an enabling entity, an important part of a typical intranet team. But I can totally see how, when you're melding the worlds of digital and physical, how they can really play an important role. So thanks for sharing that unique insight. Now, I know, Ian, that you don't work just on the intranet project at Standard Bank, that there's a number of different stakeholders across the business that you're working on delivering different solutions using not just SharePoint, but other aspects of Office 365 and beyond. And so I think our audience, those tuning in, would really benefit hearing from you how you decide who to work with, what to work with on in collaboration with them. How do you prioritize? It seems like there would be a lot of opportunity. How do you go about sussing that out and then engaging in the right spots?
So Matt, you'll see on some of the images that we're presenting here that there's multiple approaches that we typically take. Probably one of the key ones is to ensure that we focus on training. And the key philosophy we've always started from day one is not just to begin with the technology and pass it over the fence, but to really equip users to get full value from it. And training, you've got to meet people where they're at. So some people want to just use subcomponents of the Office platform, and you've got to gear it to serve their needs. Others are much more advanced users, and I think the key to it is to kind of get it pitched to a point where they're well engaged and they can leverage it. What we do try and do as a team that kind of drives out value through the platform is we do try and get into the work. So we don't just take it through secondhand information. We actually go and spend time, immerse ourselves in the business, and make sure as part of that we truly understand where those friction points are. And through a combination of training, observing what's happening in the organization, we get a very real perspective as to what we want to go and solve for, and then we go and help them to execute. And we can do that through empowering users to be self-sufficient, We sometimes co-develop some solutions with them. And in some scenarios, businesses aren't always entirely keen to do some of the technical work. They'll actually go and subcontract us to go and build a solution. But it's across those three spectrums that we would engage. And there's many different methods that we can take. Top down, we communicate to staff from our senior leadership. We do bottom-up workings, and we try and kind of leverage that. The ultimate key thing here is there's a huge amount of learnings. Some we may be imparting here, but within the broader ecosystem of Microsoft, and it's incredibly valuable to leverage those and try not to relearn when this IP exists. It's often in the public domain, and as a community of practice, we should be giving back. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for people to leverage what's out there.
Great. That was a really useful perspective, Ian, from the standpoint of how IT can work with the business. Now, I'd love to turn over to you, Jenine, representing the marketing department, one of the business stakeholders that IT typically works with. It'd be great to hear from your standpoint any coaching or tips that you would give IT professionals that might be listening in today on how they can more effectively work with business stakeholders such as yourself.
I think that the one thing that I would say is that our organizational business model plays a role, and the business is constantly evolving and changing, and we're not all on the same page. And Ian did refer to it earlier. When you break us apart in terms of the different areas within the structure, and perhaps the different countries or the different corporate functions and so on, the need, and it boils back to a comment that I made in our first video, which was that the businesses at different levels and different understandings and different maturity spaces, etc. And I think it's in the relationship that you build with the business, and the business being able to come to IT and have those open, honest conversations to say, actually, we just don't get it, or come and show us again, or how can you make this real for us so that we can utilize it in a day-to-day way, or as come and show us examples of how you would implement this tech. And a top-down approach. So get your leadership, the guys who can influence, not just from a bottom-up approach where if you provide it to the organization, they will just start using it. There's actually very few early adopters that actually just start using and figuring it out. So you also want a top-down approach. So in other words, if your leadership shows that they are taking on technology and solutions and so on, the staff will follow, because it's people want to emulate their leaders, and if they see their leadership using tech and solutions, and if that's where I have to go and do my reporting or etc., that's where I'm going to go. So yeah, that's just in a nutshell what I would suggest.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, I know there's a lot of brilliant ideas that can be worked on and delivered as part of an intranet project. Obviously, you can't do all at the same time, so you have to prioritize. And it'd be great to hear how you went about prioritizing the different scenarios that you were going to be working on. If you could walk us through that process.
Yeah, Matt. So we obviously look at the organizational business model because that plays a role for us. And then what we also did was we experienced a shift from a centralized to a decentralized model in the time that we were planning and mapping out the program of work. So our business stakeholders start from different positions according to their requirements and their understanding of an intranet platform and what the use is of such a platform. And then also the geographical and business structure considerations needs to be taken into consideration. And then, yeah, the skills and expertise of their teams also play a role. We needed to obviously review the landscape with an audit and to create a baseline of understanding for each business that would tell us what the readiness and the commitment is of different areas, establishing the levels of maturity. What I mean here is that the resource skills and the availability of resources within any of our markets or business areas, but also we needed to outline an impact analysis. So who would be impacted most and who probably wouldn't need as much upfront work, etc. We also needed to understand what the quick wins would be. And then what we did was an as-is audit, and funnily enough, we found that some of the people who were asking or screaming the loudest when we started looking at their environments, they had never used what was built for them before, because we found lorem ipsum still on their landing pages. So yeah, this enabled us to form a comprehensive prioritization picture of where to start, which areas would go first, which areas could wait a little bit, etc. Yeah, and I think the key point here is that the value for us as a complex global organization was that doing that detailed analysis and planning upfront and understanding who to prioritize for and who goes first, etc. Was very valuable. And then before activating a more agile method of technical delivery and iterations for us. So yeah, that was a good thing that we did up front that helped us later on in our program of work.
Well, thanks, Jenine. That was really helpful. And thank you, Ian. Both of you shared some great insights and learnings about how to align with your stakeholders to build an amazing intranet. I'm really excited to be taking on our next two topics. First, we're going to start with how you go about designing and implementing an intranet, and then finally, how to drive engagement and adoption amongst your end users. If you didn't hear our first part to this conversation, I would really encourage you to go back and take a listen. That's where we talk with Ian and Jenine about how they got started and what some of the challenges were that they encountered. So Ian and Jenine, thanks again for sharing with us today.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Matt. We'll see you soon.
Thanks all for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Great interview. It's so important to see how these practices play out in the real world. But now it's your turn, and I'd like to encourage you to take a couple action items from this web series. First, engage your key stakeholders. See what's important to them and what their business needs are. And next, define and understand their key priorities and key scenarios for what's unique to your business, to your industry, and your users. I'm so glad you took the time to join us today. Get through these two stages, and you're halfway there on your intranet building journey. And be sure to join us next time as we move into the implementation stage of our journey and bring your creativity, because we'll start designing scenarios and even start building prototypes. See you soon.